It was just another quiet afternoon in the small southern town of Brooksville, where the streets seemed frozen in time. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement as locals carried on with their day. Among them was Angela Carter, a sharp, resourceful woman known for her determination and grace. She had lived in Brooksville her whole life, enduring the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, prejudices that came with being one of the few black women in a predominantly white community. Angela had learned long ago how to pick her battles, but little did she know, she was about to face one of the most significant challenges of her life. Officer Greg Walker, a man with a badge and a chip on his shoulder, patrolled the streets of Brooksville like he owned them. To most, he was just another cop, but Angela had seen his true colors. Over the years, she had witnessed his misuse of power, pulling over young black men for no reason, questioning store clerks about harmless shoppers, and always managing to stay just within the bounds of the law. Greg thrived on control, and for him, Angela represented everything he despised: strength, intelligence, and defiance. Their paths had crossed before, but their encounters were always brief, polite on the surface, simmering with tension underneath. One evening, Angela was driving home after a long day at work when the familiar flash of red and blue lights lit up her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened, but she refused to panic. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. As she pulled over to the side of the road, Greg's voice crackled over his loudspeaker. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Angela's heart pounded, but she maintained her composure. She stepped out, her hands visible, and stood by her car. Greg approached with a smug expression, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "License and registration," he demanded. Angela handed over her documents, her voice calm and steady. "Is there a reason I was pulled over, Officer Walker?" Greg tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Suspicious driving," he replied vaguely. Angela knew better than to argue in the moment. She remained silent, watching as he inspected her paperwork with exaggerated scrutiny. But something was different this time. Angela wasn't just going to let this slide. She had been preparing for this day, collecting evidence, documenting incidents, and studying her rights. If Greg thought he could intimidate her, he was about to be proven wrong. Greg glanced up from her license, clearly looking for an excuse to escalate the situation. "Mind if I search your vehicle?" he asked, his tone more command than question. Angela met his gaze, her voice firm. "Actually, I do mind. Do you have a warrant?" The tension crackled in the air like a live wire. Greg wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Angela. His jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "Well, if you've got nothing to hide, then there shouldn't be a problem," he retorted, taking a step closer. Angela didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "I'm recording this interaction, Officer Walker. I know my rights, and unless you have probable cause, this stop is illegal." Greg's expression darkened. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He hadn't expected this level of resistance. Angela's confidence threw him off balance, but instead of backing off, he doubled down. "You think you're smart, huh?" he sneered. "Let's see how smart you feel when this gets real." Angela refused to be intimidated. She stood her ground, her camera recording every second. What she didn't know was that Greg had a plan, one that he thought would put her in her place. But Angela had a plan of her own, and the game they were about to play would reveal more than either of them could have anticipated. What happened next would change everything, for Angela, for Greg, and for the entire town of Brooksville. Angela could feel the weight of Greg's stare as she stood firm on the side of the road. The hum of passing cars filled the uneasy silence, a reminder that they weren't completely alone. Still, the tension between them made the world feel smaller, like everything had narrowed down to this moment. Angela's pulse raced, but she refused to let it show. She knew the stakes were high, but she also knew she had prepared for this exact situation. Greg's reputation preceded him. While some in the community praised him for being a no-nonsense officer, others, especially people like Angela, knew his actions weren't about enforcing the law. They were about power. For years, Angela had watched him target people who looked like her, twisting minor situations into excuses to assert his authority. She had heard the stories, too, about the young men who were pulled over and detained for hours, about the single mother accused of shoplifting when she was simply browsing. Angela wasn't one to sit back and accept things quietly. A few months earlier, she had started keeping a journal of incidents involving Greg. She wasn't sure what she planned to do with it at first, but as the pattern of behavior became clearer, she realized she had to act. With the help of her friend Marcus, a local attorney who had dealt with similar cases, Angela began learning her rights inside and out. "You have to know the law better than they do," Marcus had told her during one of their late-night study sessions. "They'll push, intimidate, and twist things, but if you stay calm and stand your ground, they'll run out of ways to manipulate you." Those words echoed in Angela's mind as she watched Greg pace back to his patrol car. He seemed to be stalling, flipping through her paperwork as if searching for something incriminating. Angela knew her documents were in order. Her car was registered, insured, and inspected. There was nothing for him to find. Greg returned, his demeanor cold and calculating. "You know, ma'am, you're awfully defensive for someone who claims to have nothing to hide." Angela raised an eyebrow, refusing to take the bait. "I'm not being defensive, Officer Walker. I'm just aware of my rights, and I'm exercising them. There's nothing suspicious about that." Greg let out a humorless laugh, his frustration thinly veiled. He wasn't used to people like Angela standing up to him, and it was clear he didn't like it. Still, he wasn't ready to back down. "Let's cut the attitude," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I could call a K-9 unit right now and have them search this whole car. Is that what you want?" Angela's stomach churned, but she remained calm. She knew this was a bluff, an attempt to scare her into compliance. Without probable cause, a K-9 search would still require a warrant, she replied evenly. "If you want to waste time calling for backup, that's your choice, but I'll be here recording the entire thing." Greg's jaw clenched. For a moment, Angela thought he might actually go through with it, but then his radio crackled, interrupting the standoff. He stepped away to answer it, his voice low and curt. Angela couldn't make out what he was saying, but she seized the opportunity to check her phone. She sent a quick text to Marcus. "Pulled over by Walker. Recording everything. Need advice if this escalates." Marcus replied almost immediately, "Stay calm. Don't consent to anything. Call me if he tries to detain you." Angela slipped her phone back into her pocket just as Greg returned. His expression was darker now, his eyes narrowing as he looked her over. "You're free to go," he said abruptly, shoving her documents back into her hands. "But don't think for a second that this is over." Angela didn't respond. She took her paperwork, climbed back into her car, and drove off, her heart pounding in her chest. She kept her eyes on the road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds to make sure Greg wasn't following her. When she finally pulled into her driveway, she let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The encounter had been nerve-wracking, but she felt a small sense of victory. She had stood her ground, and Greg hadn't been able to intimidate her into submission. Still, she knew this wasn't the end. Over the next few days, Angela became increasingly aware of Greg's presence around town. She would spot his patrol car parked across the street from her workplace or see him driving slowly through her neighborhood. It was clear he was trying to send a message, but Angela refused to let him scare her. Meanwhile, she continued gathering evidence. She spoke to others in the community who had similar encounters with Greg, documenting their stories and compiling them into a detailed report. Some were hesitant to speak out, fearing retaliation, but Angela's courage inspired others to come forward. One evening, Marcus called her with some news. "I've been looking into Walker's record," he said. "There's a pattern here, complaints, internal investigations, but nothing ever sticks. It's like he's untouchable." Angela wasn't surprised. "That's why we need to be smart about this," she said. "If we can catch him in the act, with undeniable evidence, they won't be able to ignore it." And so, Angela's plan began to take shape. She started carrying a second phone, one equipped with a discreet recording app, in case she encountered Greg again. She also installed a dashcam in her car, making sure it captured both video and audio. It wasn't long before Greg gave her another opportunity. One night, as Angela was leaving a community meeting about police accountability, she noticed his patrol car parked at the end of the block. She felt his eyes on her as she walked to her car, but she pretended not to notice. As soon as she pulled out onto the street, the red and blue lights lit up her rearview mirror once again. Angela's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she pulled over, her dashcam already recording. This time, she wasn't just prepared, she was ready to take control. Greg approached her car with the same smug expression as before, but Angela noticed something different in his eyes. There was a flicker of desperation, a sense that he knew he was losing his grip on the situation. "Evening, ma'am," he said, leaning against her car window. "Mind telling me where you're headed at this hour?" Angela kept her voice steady. "Home, Officer Walker. Is there a reason you pulled me over?" Greg's smirk faltered, just for a moment. "You were driving a little too close to the car in front of you," he said. "That's a safety violation." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Because my dashcam has been recording my entire drive, and I don't recall tailgating anyone." For the first time, Greg seemed genuinely caught off guard. He straightened up, his hand resting on his belt. "Dashcam, huh? That's cute. Let's see how cute you are when I write you a citation." Angela's heart raced, but she didn't let it show. She knew this was just another attempt to intimidate her. What Greg didn't know was that Angela had more than just a dashcam on her side. She had a growing network of allies, a carefully laid plan, and the determination to see this through. As Greg walked back to his patrol car, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was far from over. She didn't know what Greg's next move would be, but one thing was certain: she was ready for it. What happened next would not only test Angela's resolve but also reveal the lengths Greg was willing to go to maintain his power. Angela sat in her car for a moment, letting the engine idle as she replayed the interaction in her mind. She had stood her ground again, but there was a gnawing feeling in her gut that Greg wasn't going to let this go. This was no longer about a simple traffic stop, it was about control, ego, and the lengths someone like Greg would go to maintain his authority. Angela had dealt with difficult people before, but Greg felt different. He wasn't just trying to intimidate her, he seemed determined to break her spirit. As she pulled away and drove home, Angela thought about the people who had shared their stories with her. A young man named Jamal had told her about being stopped 3 times in 1 week for vague reasons like looking suspicious. An older woman named Cynthia had spoken about the time Greg followed her from the grocery store to her home, only to accuse her of acting nervous when she asked why. Their stories fueled Angela's determination, but they also reminded her of the risks she was taking. People like Greg didn't back down easily, and Angela knew she needed to stay one step ahead. The next morning, Angela met Marcus at a local diner to discuss her plan. Marcus had always been a steady presence in her life, someone who believed in justice even when the odds were stacked against them. As they sipped their coffee, Angela laid out her idea. "I've got enough footage and documentation to paint a clear picture," she said, her voice low so no one could overhear. "But I think we need something stronger, something that shows, without a doubt, what he's doing. If we can catch him in the act of violating someone's rights, it'll be impossible for the department to sweep it under the rug." Marcus nodded, but his expression was cautious. "Angela, I admire your courage, but you need to be careful. Greg's already targeting you, and if he feels cornered, he might escalate. This isn't just about getting evidence, it's about making sure you stay safe." Angela appreciated Marcus's concern, but she couldn't ignore the bigger picture. If we don't stand up to him, he's going to keep doing this. Not just to me, but to everyone. Someone has to hold him accountable. Over the next few days, Angela and Marcus worked together to refine their approach. They reached out to a local journalist who had been investigating police misconduct in the area, sharing what they had gathered so far. The journalist, a young woman named Elena, was immediately interested in the story. She agreed to help expose Greg's behavior, but she needed something concrete, something that would force the department to act. While Angela focused on gathering more evidence, Greg's behavior grew more brazen. He seemed to be everywhere she went, at the grocery store, parked near her gym, even driving past her house late at night. Angela felt a mix of anger and fear, but she refused to let it paralyze her. Instead, she used it as motivation to push forward. One evening, Angela attended a community forum on police accountability. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, young and old, black and white, all eager to share their experiences and demand change. Angela listened as person after person stood up to speak, their voices trembling with emotion as they recounted their encounters with officers like Greg. It was both heartbreaking and galvanizing, a reminder of why she was doing this. When it was Angela's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Angela Carter," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "And like many of you, I've experienced firsthand what it's like to be targeted by someone who's supposed to protect and serve. But I'm not here to talk about fear, I'm here to talk about action. Angela went on to share her plan, urging others to join her in documenting their encounters and holding officers accountable. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Angela felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight, and together, they were stronger than Greg could ever imagine. But Greg wasn't going to back down quietly. The very next day, Angela noticed a black sedan parked across the street from her house. It wasn't Greg's patrol car, but something about it felt off. The windows were tinted, and the driver seemed to be watching her. Angela snapped a photo and sent it to Marcus, who immediately told her to stay vigilant. "This is intimidation," Marcus said over the phone. "He's trying to rattle you. Don't give him the satisfaction." Angela nodded, though her nerves were fraying. She installed security cameras around her home and made sure her neighbors were aware of the situation. If Greg thought he could scare her into silence, he was sorely mistaken. Meanwhile, Elena had uncovered something significant. During her research, she discovered that Greg had been involved in a questionable incident years earlier in another town. A young man had filed a formal complaint against him for excessive force, but the case had been quietly dropped after the man was mysteriously arrested on unrelated charges. Elena's findings added another layer to the story, and Angela knew they were getting closer to the truth. One night, as Angela was driving home from a meeting with Marcus and Elena, she noticed headlights in her rearview mirror. The car followed her for several blocks, staying just far enough behind to avoid suspicion. Angela's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she turned onto a quieter street, hoping to confirm her suspicions. Sure enough, the car turned with her. Angela's heart raced as she reached for her phone and started recording. She pulled into a well-lit gas station, hoping the driver would either back off or reveal themselves. To her relief, the car drove past without stopping, but the encounter left her shaken. She couldn't help but wonder if it was Greg, or someone working on his behalf. As the days passed, Angela felt the walls closing in. Greg's presence was becoming more menacing, and the weight of what she was trying to accomplish grew heavier. But she refused to give up. Every story she heard, every piece of evidence she collected, strengthened her resolve. The turning point came when Angela received a call from an unexpected ally, a young rookie officer who had witnessed Greg's behavior firsthand. The officer, who introduced himself as Officer Ramirez, expressed his frustration with the corruption within the department. "I've seen what he does," Ramirez said, his voice filled with both anger and regret. "But no one will speak out against him. They're either scared or complicit. I want to help, but you need to promise to keep my name out of it." Angela agreed, her mind racing with possibilities. Ramirez provided her with internal memos and records that painted a damning picture of Greg's conduct. It was the break Angela had been waiting for, but it also raised the stakes. If Greg found out, there was no telling what he might do. As Angela pieced everything together, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was about to break. She was close to exposing Greg for who he really was, but the closer she got, the more dangerous the situation became. What Angela didn't know was that Greg was already planning his next move. A move that would force her to confront him head-on. The story was far from over, and Angela's fight for justice was just beginning. Angela sat in her living room, her phone on the coffee table in front of her, the screen glowing with a paused video. It was one of her dashcam recordings, a piece of evidence that, along with everything else she had gathered, painted a clear picture of Greg's abuse of power. But as much as she wanted to feel triumphant, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a razor-thin line. Greg wasn't the type to let go quietly, and Angela knew the closer she got to exposing him, the more dangerous he would become. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Angela's mind wandered to the meeting she had planned for the next evening. Elena was putting together a small group of community members who were willing to speak out publicly, along with Marcus and a few other legal experts. The goal was to present their findings in a way that couldn't be ignored, not by the media, not by the police department, and certainly not by Greg. Angela knew it was risky, but she also knew they were running out of time. Greg wasn't just watching her anymore, he was actively trying to undermine her efforts. The knock at the door made her jump. Angela's heart pounded as she approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man stood on her porch, dressed in plain clothes but with the unmistakable air of someone who wanted to be taken seriously. She opened the door a crack, keeping the chain in place. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her stomach. "Miss Carter?" the man asked. "I'm Detective Harris with Internal Affairs. I'd like to speak with you about a matter involving Officer Walker." Angela hesitated, her mind racing. She hadn't expected Internal Affairs to get involved, at least not yet. Still, she opened the door, gesturing for him to come inside. Harris wasted no time. "We've been made aware of some allegations against Officer Walker," he began, pulling out a notebook. "And I understand you've been documenting his behavior." Angela studied him carefully, trying to gauge whether he was genuinely there to help or simply fishing for information. "I have," she said cautiously. "But why now? He's been doing this for years, and no one has done anything about it." Harris sighed, his expression grim. "It's complicated. Walker's had complaints filed against him before, but there's never been enough evidence to take action. Your case is different. From what I've heard, you've got a lot more than just complaints, you've got proof." Angela nodded, though she didn't fully trust him yet. "If you know what he's been doing, why haven't you stopped him?" "It's not that simple," Harris replied. "Walker's been careful. He knows how to manipulate the system, and he's got allies in the department who cover for him. But if you're willing to share what you've got, we might finally be able to hold him accountable." Angela wanted to believe him, but something about the timing felt off. Why would Internal Affairs suddenly take an interest now, after years of ignoring Greg's behavior? She decided to play it safe. "I'll think about it," she said. "But I need to consult with my lawyer first." Harris nodded, though Angela could see the disappointment in his eyes. "I understand," he said, standing to leave. "But be careful. If Walker knows you're building a case against him, he won't take it lightly." After Harris left, Angela called Marcus and told him about the visit. "Something doesn't feel right," she said. "Why would they show up now, out of the blue?" Marcus agreed. "It could be legitimate, but it could also be a trap. Until we know for sure, don't hand over anything. We'll stick to the plan." The next day, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. On her way to work, she noticed the same black sedan from before trailing her for several blocks. When she turned into a grocery store parking lot to see if the car would follow, it parked a few rows away. Angela snapped a picture and sent it to Marcus, who confirmed her suspicions. "That's no coincidence," he said. "You're under surveillance. Be extra careful, Angela. They're trying to intimidate you." Angela's resolve hardened. If Greg thought he could scare her into backing down, he was wrong. She met with Elena and Marcus that evening, going over their plan for the upcoming meeting. Elena had secured a space at a local community center, and several people who had experienced Greg's harassment firsthand had agreed to speak. They would also present the evidence Angela had gathered, along with testimony from Officer Ramirez. As they talked, Angela's phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from an unknown number, and the message sent a chill down her spine. *, you're making a mistake. Drop this before it's too late, *. Angela showed the message to Marcus, who immediately contacted a cybersecurity expert he knew. "We'll trace this," he said, his voice firm. "They're getting desperate. That means we're getting close." The night of the meeting arrived, and Angela couldn't shake the tension in the air. The community center was packed, with people spilling out into the hallway. Elena opened the event with a brief introduction, thanking everyone for coming and explaining the purpose of the meeting. As Angela stepped up to the microphone, she could feel the weight of the room's collective hope and frustration. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "For too long, people like Greg Walker have operated without accountability. But tonight, we're going to change that." She began presenting her evidence, starting with her dashcam footage and moving on to the stories of others who had encountered Greg. The room was silent, the tension palpable as Angela laid out her case. But just as she was about to introduce Officer Ramirez, the doors to the community center burst open. Greg stood in the doorway, flanked by two other officers, his face twisted with anger. "This meeting is over," he announced, his voice echoing through the room. "Everyone needs to leave immediately." The crowd erupted in protest, but Angela remained calm. She met Greg's gaze, refusing to look away. "You can't silence us," she said, her voice unwavering. "Not anymore." Greg took a step forward, his hand resting on his belt. "You're playing a dangerous game, Angela," he said. "And you're about to lose." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Angela knew this was the moment everything had been building toward. The truth was about to come to light, but at what cost? The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Angela stood her ground, her pulse pounding in her ears as Greg glared at her from the doorway. His presence was electric, charging the air with a mix of fear and defiance. For a moment, no one moved, as though everyone was collectively holding their breath, waiting to see who would act first. Elena broke the silence, stepping forward with a calm but firm tone. "Officer Walker, this is a public meeting, and you have no authority to shut it down. We're well within our rights to gather here." Greg's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he took another step forward. "You think you know the law, Ms. Alvarez? Let me remind you that disrupting public peace is a crime. And this," he gestured to the crowd, "is a disruption." Angela didn't flinch. She could feel the weight of every person in the room behind her, their collective frustration giving her strength. "The only one disrupting anything here is you," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You're trying to intimidate us because you know we're telling the truth. But you can't stop us. Not anymore." Greg's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? We'll see about that." Before he could say another word, the sound of a phone chiming broke the moment. Angela glanced down at her own phone, startled to see a notification from Marcus. It was a text message, simple but urgent. "Don't leave. Something big is about to happen. Angela's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what Marcus was referring to, but she trusted him. She slipped the phone into her pocket, her mind racing. Greg was clearly trying to provoke her into making a mistake, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Then, almost as if on cue, the doors at the back of the room opened again. This time, it wasn't officers, it was a small group of people, led by Marcus and another man Angela didn't recognize. The man was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a commanding presence that immediately drew the room's attention. He wore a suit and carried a leather briefcase, his expression calm but purposeful. Greg turned to face the newcomers, his eyes narrowing as recognition flashed across his face. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice laced with anger. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the front of the room, stopping just a few feet from Greg. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but firm. "I'm Special Agent Daniels with the Department of Justice. We've been monitoring this situation for some time, and it seems things have reached a tipping point." The crowd murmured in surprise, the tension shifting as Daniels' presence introduced an unexpected layer to the unfolding drama. Angela felt a flicker of hope, but she kept her expression neutral. This wasn't over, not yet. Greg's face turned red, his composure slipping for the first time. "This is none of your business," he snapped. "You have no jurisdiction here." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his demeanor unshaken. "When it comes to civil rights violations and corruption within law enforcement, we absolutely have jurisdiction. And based on the evidence we've gathered, much of which, I believe, Ms. Carter and her team have contributed, we have serious concerns about your conduct, Officer Walker." The room erupted into whispers and gasps, but Daniels wasn't finished. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "This investigation is ongoing, and I can't share all the details at this time. However, I want to commend everyone here for their courage in standing up for justice. Your voices matter, and we're here to ensure they're heard." Angela felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by the realization that Greg wasn't going to back down easily. He had too much to lose, and his ego wouldn't allow him to walk away without a fight. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over?" Greg spat, his voice rising. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Daniels didn't flinch. "I suggest you choose your next words carefully, Officer Walker. Anything you say can and will be used against you." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for a moment, it seemed Greg might explode. But then his expression shifted, his anger morphing into something more calculated. He glanced around the room, his gaze landing on Angela. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but menacing. "Not for you, not for any of you." With that, he turned and stormed out of the room, the other officers trailing behind him. The tension lingered even after he was gone, the weight of his words settling over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Angela exhaled slowly, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table in front of her. Daniels placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've done incredible work," he said quietly. "But this fight isn't over yet. Stay vigilant. We'll do our part, but you need to stay safe." As the meeting wrapped up, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's parting words were more than just an empty threat. He was planning something that could jeopardize everything they had worked for. Later that night, as Angela drove home, she noticed the black sedan again, trailing her from a distance. Her stomach tightened, but she kept her focus on the road, determined not to let fear consume her. When she arrived home, she checked her security cameras, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. Everything seemed normal, but Angela couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. As she settled into bed, her phone buzzed with another message. This time, it was from Elena. We've got more evidence. Meet me first thing in the morning. Angela stared at the screen, a mix of exhaustion and determination washing over her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. The fight was far from over. And whatever Greg was planning, she would be ready. The morning came faster than Angela expected, and she barely slept. Elena's message had been playing on repeat in her mind, fueling a mixture of hope and anxiety. She left her house early, careful to check for any signs of the black sedan or anything unusual. The streets were quiet, and for a moment, she allowed herself to think that maybe the worst was over. But deep down, she knew better. Greg wasn't the type to let things end quietly. At the cafe where they agreed to meet, Elena was already waiting with a laptop and a stack of documents. Her expression was grave but determined as Angela slid into the seat across from her. Without a word, Elena turned the laptop around and pressed play on a video file. Angela leaned in, her heart racing as the screen came to life. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. It showed Greg in what appeared to be a warehouse, meeting with two men who looked more like hired muscle than anything else. Their conversation was muffled but clear enough to catch key phrases. Make it look like an accident, take care of her, and she's gotten too close. Angela felt her stomach drop as the realization hit her. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. Greg was planning something far more sinister. This was sent anonymously, Elena explained, her voice low. I don't know who recorded it, but it's legit. Marcus is running a trace on the file to see if we can figure out where this warehouse is. Angela's hands trembled as she closed the laptop. He's escalating, she said quietly. He knows we're too close to exposing him, and now he's desperate. Elena nodded. We have to act fast. Daniels and his team are ready to move, but they need concrete evidence to make an arrest. This video helps, but we need more. Before Angela could respond, her phone buzzed with a call from Marcus. She answered quickly, her pulse pounding. We found the warehouse, Marcus said without preamble. It's on the outskirts of town, and it's active. If Greg's planning something, it's happening there. Angela exchanged a look with Elena. We have to go, she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. We can't let him get away with this. Elena hesitated but eventually nodded. I'll call Daniels. He'll want to coordinate this carefully. We can't risk tipping Greg off. Within an hour, they were parked a safe distance from the warehouse, watching as a team of unmarked cars pulled into position. Daniels stepped out, his expression a mix of focus and urgency. He briefed his team quickly, outlining the plan to enter the building and secure any evidence while minimizing risk. Angela stayed in the car with Elena, her heart racing as the agents moved in. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Angela watched as the agents disappeared into the warehouse, their movements precise and deliberate. Then, suddenly, the sound of shouting erupted, followed by a series of loud crashes. Angela's instincts screamed at her to stay put, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Against Elena's protests, she stepped out of the car and moved closer, staying behind cover as she approached the building. Inside, chaos had erupted. Greg was shouting orders, his voice echoing through the large space as he tried to evade capture. Angela peeked through a broken window, her breath catching as she saw Greg holding a folder filled with papers. He was frantically trying to stuff them into a duffel bag, his movements panicked and erratic. But what caught Angela's attention wasn't just Greg. It was the figure standing in the shadows, a camera in hand. It was Officer Ramirez. He wasn't just a whistleblower, he had been working undercover to gather evidence against Greg. And now, with the camera in hand, he had captured everything, the bribes, the threats, and even Greg's plans to harm Angela. Greg turned suddenly, spotting Ramirez. His face twisted with rage as he lunged toward him, but before he could get close, Daniels and his team burst into the room, weapons drawn. It's over, Walker. Daniels shouted. Drop the bag and step away. For a moment, it seemed like Greg might comply. But then, in a desperate move, he grabbed the duffel bag and bolted toward a side exit. Angela didn't think, she acted. Running around the side of the building, she intercepted him just as he emerged, her phone held up to record the encounter. "Stop, Greg," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "It's over. Everything you've done is out in the open now." Greg froze, his eyes wild as he looked between Angela and the approaching agents. For a split second, it seemed like he might lash out. But then, as the weight of his situation sank in, he dropped the bag and sank to his knees, his hands raised in surrender. Daniel's team moved in, securing Greg and confiscating the duffel bag. Angela stepped back, her legs trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. Ramirez emerged from the warehouse, his camera still rolling. He gave Angela a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured to get to this point. But just as Angela allowed herself to breathe, a voice crackled over Daniel's radio. "We found something," an agent said. "There's a second location tied to Walker, a storage unit with more evidence." Angela's relief was short-lived as Daniels turned to her, his expression serious. "This isn't over yet," he said. "Greg's network runs deeper than we thought. But thanks to you, we have a real chance to take it all down." As the agents loaded Greg into a car, Angela stood in the fading light, the weight of everything finally sinking in. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. And as she watched the cars pull away, she couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's parting words still held a grain of truth. This wasn't over. But now, Angela was ready. Angela stood outside the warehouse, watching as the cars carrying Greg and the evidence disappeared into the distance. The tension in her body slowly began to unwind, but a deep exhaustion set in just as quickly. She glanced at Ramirez, who was still holding his camera, his expression a mix of relief and determination. There were no words exchanged between them in that moment, but there didn't need to be. They had both risked everything to get to this point, and now, for the first time, it felt like justice might finally be within reach. Daniels approached her, his posture relaxed but his face still serious. "You did a brave thing today," he said. "But this is just the beginning. The evidence we've collected here is damning, but it's going to take time to unravel everything. Greg didn't act alone, and we need to make sure everyone involved is held accountable." Angela nodded, her mind racing. She thought about all the people Greg had hurt, all the lives he had disrupted in his relentless pursuit of power and control. The weight of it all was overwhelming, but she also felt a spark of hope. Change was coming, even if it wouldn't happen overnight. "Whatever you need, I'll help," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I'm not walking away from this." Daniels gave her a small smile. "I wouldn't expect you to." The hours that followed were a blur of statements, phone calls, and paperwork. By the time Angela made it home, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden light over her neighborhood. She parked her car and sat there for a moment, staring at the quiet street. The black sedan was gone, and for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Inside, she collapsed onto her couch, the events of the past few days replaying in her mind like a whirlwind. She thought about Elena, Marcus, Ramirez, and all the others who had stood by her side. They had faced threats, intimidation, and fear, but they had never given up. It was a reminder of how powerful people could be when they came together for a common cause. Over the next few weeks, the fallout from Greg's arrest was monumental. The news broke quickly, with headlines detailing the corruption, cover-ups, and abuses of power that had plagued the department. Angela's story was at the center of it all, her bravery highlighted in countless articles and interviews. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but she understood the importance of speaking out. If her story could inspire others to stand up against injustice, then it was worth it. Greg's trial became a media sensation, with every detail scrutinized and debated. The evidence collected from the warehouse and the storage unit painted a damning picture of his actions, and the testimony from Ramirez and others only solidified the case against him. Watching him sit in the courtroom, stripped of the authority he had wielded so recklessly, Angela felt a sense of closure. He was finally being held accountable, and that was all she had ever wanted. But the road ahead was still long. The systemic issues within the department weren't going to disappear just because Greg was gone. Angela knew that real change required more than just one victory. It required sustained effort, accountability, and a commitment to doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. She threw herself into advocacy work, partnering with Elena and other community leaders to push for reforms. They held town hall meetings, organized workshops, and worked closely with Daniels and his team to ensure that the changes they fought for were meaningful and lasting. It wasn't easy, and there were days when Angela felt like giving up. But every time she looked at the people around her, the mothers, fathers, and children who deserved to live in a safer, fairer world, she found the strength to keep going. One evening, months after Greg's conviction, Angela found herself sitting on her porch with Elena. The two of them shared a quiet moment, sipping tea as the sun set over the neighborhood. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Elena asked, breaking the silence. "It feels like just yesterday we were sitting in that community center, wondering if we'd ever be able to make a difference." Angela smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think about it all the time," she said. "It's still hard to believe sometimes. But we did it, and we're not done yet." Elena nodded, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Not even close." As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Angela continued to fight for justice. She became a voice for her community, someone people turned to when they needed hope or guidance. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it felt right. She had found her purpose in the struggle, and she wasn't afraid to keep pushing forward. One afternoon, as she was leaving a meeting at City Hall, Angela received a message from Ramirez. It was a simple text, but it brought a smile to her face. Asterisk. More work to do, but progress is happening. Stay strong. Asterisk. She stared at the message for a moment, then slipped her phone into her pocket and stepped into the sunlight. The world wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But Angela had learned that even in the face of darkness, there was always light to be found. And as long as she could fight for that light, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The story of Greg's downfall became a symbol of resilience and accountability, a reminder that no one is above the law and that change is always possible when people come together. And while Angela's journey was far from over, she faced the future with a sense of purpose and hope that she hadn't felt in years. As she walked down the steps of City Hall, the sound of children laughing in the distance filled the air. Angela smiled, feeling the weight of the past begin to lift. This was what she had been fighting for, a better, brighter future for everyone. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep fighting.